So what is Bitcoin actually used for? And the quick answer to that question is to solve property rights infringements, of which there are tons in the world today. But I'm going to take a bit longer to answer this critical question, which I guess I get asked so often. Just general observers of Bitcoin will see all the price volatility and the news flow and people speculating on these assets and ask themselves, the question, is anybody actually using this on the ground? Detractors will, of course, go as far as to say that nobody is actually using Bitcoin day to day. And even people within crypto markets themselves who are perhaps more interested in other use cases, things like NFTs and DeFi, some of these people even doubt that Bitcoin is a useful asset. They think it's some kind of archaic relic. So, what I'm going to do in this video is provide you with a number of tangible use cases, examples of people using Bitcoin on an everyday basis to solve real economic problems. And as I said at the start, the key overarching reason here is to solve property rights infringements, right? We all own some types of property, and there are infringements on that. Sometimes the value is changed. Sometimes we're restricted in how we can use that property, right? So the first group here is people who suffer from inflation and currency debasement, and they're trying to store their wealth through time and space. Right? Because Bitcoin is scarce and has strong network effects, it tends to hold its value over long periods of time. Volatile, yes, but over any 4-year rolling period, Bitcoin's price change has always been positive. Right? This is very useful for people who are trying to store their value over long periods of time. At the extreme, it's very obvious for people who are living in hyperinflation, like Venezuela has experienced over recent years. They are losing value very quickly, very rapidly in Venezuelan bolivars, and they want to save in an alternative currency. So something that holds its value over long periods of time, very beneficial to people in Venezuela. Of course, that's an extreme case scenario, but even, people living in Turkey, as an example, they've also suffered extreme currency losses in the Turkish lira, and it would have been advantageous for Turkish people to save in Bitcoin. And the truth is that even in countries that aren't suffering from rapid currency debasement or high inflation, everybody's still suffering from some degree of currency debasement and some degree of inflation. So the idea of storing wealth in a scarce asset that holds its value over long periods of time is advantageous. And now you might ask the question, why use Bitcoin rather than US dollars, right? But the truth is that Bitcoin stores value better than US dollars because it's gained so much in US dollars over any 4-year rolling period, as we've seen before. Second, access to US dollars can actually sometimes be restricted in certain countries, and particularly in more developing countries. Sometimes you need to get travel tickets and passports in order to get hold of a foreign currency, and that's particularly challenging. So buying Bitcoin can sometimes be easier than buying dollars. And over and above that, Bitcoin obviously functions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's much easier sometimes to trade in than US dollars. And then over and above that, securing and transporting Bitcoin can also be easier. You just save it digitally. You want to move across the border, you just walk across the border with your digital device rather than carrying something physical. And then lastly, US dollar payments are not always particularly cheap. And this gets me onto another example here, is that the remittance market is sometimes very expensive to some countries. Payments might be reasonably cheap in developed countries, but people in developed countries that are sending their capital to their family home in Central America or in Africa or wherever it might be sometimes pay very high fees, sometimes more than 10%. So, while Bitcoin transactions aren't necessarily free and they're not necessarily instant, they can often be much quicker and much cheaper than using global remittance networks. And this example actually of global remittances is one of the early use cases of Bitcoin, and it's still a strong use case today. Another broad group is people who suffer from confiscation or destruction of their actual property. Your property rights are only really as secure as the property rights are secured in the country in which you live. And not all countries provide the luxury of property rights protection to their citizens. So as an example, a recent example, in Ukraine, many people lost their life savings, whether it be through confiscation, actually, foreign forces coming over the border and taking their assets, whether it be actual destruction, and sometimes they're just, fleeing the country. So saving one's capital in a digital asset that's borderless, where it's easy to move across the border with that asset, can be far safer despite the volatility in the underlying asset. And there are examples of Ukrainians who just crossed the border into Poland, and they were able to set up their life because they had some capital saved in Bitcoin. And even across the border in Russia, once again, there were examples of people using Bitcoin in order to circumvent Russian exchange controls that were applied at the onset of the war because the currency, the Russian ruble, was depreciating. So a number of examples here of people protecting themselves from property confiscation or destruction. The next group is people who suffer from censorship, right? Because the quality here is that Bitcoin is the censorship resistant network. You don't need to ask anybody for permission in order to use Bitcoin. And what's interesting is a lot of detractors, they use this quality and they focus on the negative characteristics. Right? Some people don't like that criminals can use Bitcoin because it is the censorship-resistant network. You can't prevent criminals from using it. But these detractors, what they're doing is they're ignoring the other side to this coin here, right? Yes, some people we don't like can use the network, but other people who are restricted in their financial access in wherever they might be in the world use Bitcoin as this tool for freedom because they're so restricted. Right? So a few examples of this. Women in some countries don't have bank accounts. In Afghanistan, they have restrictions on gender. And there are examples of women who've been able to go online, do online work, coding and programming, and get paid in Bitcoin. So that's not only them, using the asset for saving and the network, but being able to actually open up a bank account, a wallet in Bitcoin. Pretty profound and useful for these people. Another example in the political realm, which I guess Afghanistan is also a political example, but people in Belarus and Nigeria who have been political opponents and they have been excluded from commerce and banking services because the government doesn't like them. And once again, these people have been able to do crowdfunding for their campaign against a oppressive government and be able to do that crowdfunding campaign through Bitcoin because it's this global network that cannot be censored. Another example that's slightly more innocuous and a bit closer to home is something like trading in GameStop or GME stocks in January 2021. That's also was a property rights infringement. The custodians and the exchanges decided to halt trading in that share because of whatever reasons they might have had, but that was a infringement on people who wanted to conduct trade there, right? And that is that's not really particularly fair, and it highlights the ability in a censorship resistant network not to have that example, right? In Bitcoin, you can't restrict people from trading it, maybe on a specific exchange, but there's lots of different exchanges in the world where you can trade Bitcoin, and you can also trade it peer-to-peer, and people cannot restrict that. Another quick example, also close to home in the West, was Canadian government's the Canadian government's decision to freeze bank accounts of everybody who was involved in the trucker protests in 2022. That's another gross property rights violation. What if you've got a bank account, you decide to donate, just because you have a political persuasion in a certain direction, and now you get restricted on your access to your bank account? That's pretty severe, not the type of thing that we expect to see in Western governments. So coming back to one of the examples I made earlier in this talk is just, often we think that Bitcoin is used only in really underdeveloped, developing countries where there are gross property rights violations. But the truth is that there also are property rights violations in developed countries too. And then one last example is, exclusion can take place in even more innocuous conditions. There are a lot of people in countries who don't have access to bank accounts. I mean, the stat is that there's more people with access to mobile phones, to cell phones, than there are to bank accounts. And with Bitcoin, as long as you've got access to the internet and a mobile phone, you can get onto the Bitcoin network. So that means you can get access to financial services where your local banking sector might not be providing that to you. So that's pretty powerful, pretty profound. So as you can see, there are millions of people suffering from all sorts of property rights infringements around the world today, from inflation, currency debasement, theft, confiscation, restrictions on access. These examples might be more obvious in certain, oppressive countries around the world, but they actually exist in supposedly free countries too. And Bitcoin's characteristics as this global, borderless store of value that's easy to buy, easy to transport, easy to secure, and it's censorship resistant. This is valuable to a wide range of people around the world today. Yes, it might be speculative as an asset, it might be volatile, sure, but to mistake the real use cases to millions of people around the world is an error in judgment. If you don't think that Bitcoin is useful to you, I encourage you to leave a comment down below. Let me know. I think we can probably find that Bitcoin does have a valuable use case for you too. I'm Rob Price. Thanks for your time. Like the video and subscribe if you want to see more of this content, and we'll chat soon.